They say you don't truly know the person sleeping beside you until the day they decide the cost of keeping you outweighs the value of what you built together. For nearly 2 decades, Becky was my wife, or at least that's what the joint tax returns said. But standing in the biting October wind, watching the front door keypad flash a cold, mocking red, I understood something that no cardiologist could have prepared me for. I wasn't a husband anymore. I was a liability on her balance sheet, and she had just written me off. I had come straight from the doctor's office. Routine follow-up. 6 months after the stroke, and the numbers were improving, blood pressure steady, cognition sharp, the slight tremor in my right hand the only visible reminder of what my body had been through. I remember thinking how peaceful the house looked from the driveway. Warm amber light bleeding through the downstairs windows, the old oak by the mailbox dropping its last leaves across the stone path. The kind of house people slow their cars to admire. I typed in the door code. Red light. I frowned and tried again, slower, my finger deliberate. Red light. I stood there a moment, just staring at the keypad the way you stare at a column of numbers that refuses to balance. Then I tried the garage. Nothing. Not even the mechanical click of the motor engaging. Just silence where there should have been sound. That's when I saw it through the narrow glass panel beside the front door, sitting on the kitchen island, held flat by the crystal paperweight we'd bought on our anniversary in Charleston. A note. I walked around to the side gate, still unlocked. She hadn't thought of that. The kitchen smelled of rosemary. She had cooked earlier. The dishwasher hummed softly. Everything was disturbingly, insultingly normal except for the folded piece of paper sitting in the center of the marble island. I'm done, the house is sold. Take what's yours and go. No signature, no explanation, just a clean surgical severing, the kind I'd seen in fraudulent contracts, the kind designed to look final, to make the other party believe the transaction is already closed. I stood there longer than I care to admit, not because I was in shock. Shock is loud, emotional, disorienting. This was quieter. This was the cold recognition that the numbers had finally revealed what I had only suspected. I heard movement upstairs, a floorboard, then the soft creak of the landing. Becky, I called. She appeared at the top of the staircase, framed by the chandelier light, silk blouse, hair pinned back, posture composed. The same woman I'd married 17 years ago. Just harder around the edges now. Something in her eyes had been calculating, and she'd been calculating it for a while. You saw the note, she said. It wasn't a question. I looked down at the paper, then back up at her. You can't sell this house without my signature, Becky. She descended 3 steps and stopped, keeping the distance intentional, the way people do when they've rehearsed the conversation but aren't entirely sure of the outcome. I don't need your signature, Collins. You signed the power of attorney in the hospital. Remember, you were tired, you trusted me. She said it gently, almost as though she were reminding a child of something obvious. The house is already sold. The closing is next week. I think it's better if you find somewhere else to be before then. The wind pressed against the windows. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. I looked at Becky for a long moment. Then I looked back down at the note. I turned it over, picked up the pen from the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she kept the takeout menus and the extra keys she'd clearly already collected, and I wrote 2 words on the back of that paper. I set it back on the island, walked out through the side gate, and I did not look up at the window where I knew she was already watching. 3 hours later, my phone began to vibrate. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're from. I'm reading every single one. And if you've ever been counted out by someone who was supposed to be in your corner, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because what I did next took 17 years of patience and about 4 hours of very precise paperwork. My name is Collins. I'm a forensic accountant, and the house wasn't sold. It never could have been. Because 12 years ago, before the stroke, before the tremor, before Becky started looking at me like a problem she hadn't yet solved, I put it in a trust, an irrevocable trust, the kind you cannot sell, cannot transfer, cannot touch, no matter what a power of attorney says. She liked the lifestyle, but she never bothered to read the paperwork and the note she left me. The one she thought was the end of this story. I left it on the kitchen island, 2 words written on the back. Check again. She didn't know it yet, but those 2 words were the beginning of the longest audit of her life, and I had already started the work. Diane's office smelled like cold coffee and consequence. That's the only way I can describe it, the particular atmosphere of a room where bad news gets organized into actionable strategy. She had 3 monitors running when I walked in, her reading glasses pushed up into her silver-streaked hair, a yellow legal pad already covered in her sharp, economical handwriting. She didn't ask how I was doing. Diane never wasted time on questions she already knew the answers to. I set the folder on her desk. She opened it without ceremony, the way a surgeon opens a patient calmly, precisely, with the full understanding that what's inside may be worse than the outside suggested. She read the first page, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I had worked with Diane long enough to know that was the equivalent of anyone else slamming a fist on the table. When did she file this? Diane said. Thursday, I told her, while I was at the cardiologist. She set the paper down and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She timed it. That was all she said. She didn't need to say more. We both understood the architecture of what Becky had constructed, not a desperate, impulsive act, but a scheduled one. A woman who had watched the calendar, waited for the right window of vulnerability, and moved with deliberate, practiced efficiency. The kind of efficiency you only develop when you've been planning something for a very long time. Diane pulled up the county recorder's database on her center screen. She typed in the property address. The deed transfer populated immediately, filed at 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, notarized, time-stamped, and formally submitted while I was sitting in a waiting room being told my heart was getting stronger. The grantor line read, Collins R. Whitfield. My name, my signature, except I had never touched that document in my life. The signature on the deed looks like mine, I said quietly, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. But the ink was still wet. Diane enlarged the scanned image and said nothing for a moment. She was studying it the way I study a falsified ledger, looking not for what's there, but for what shouldn't be. The pen pressure was slightly off. The loop on the capital C was tighter than my natural hand, and the notary stamp, she zoomed in on it, was issued from a county 2 states away, which meant either Becky had traveled specifically to file it outside the local jurisdiction, or someone had done that errand for her. Someone like Sterling Reed, whose condo projects had offices in 3 states, 2 of which shared a border with ours. Pull her credit activity, I said. Diane was already typing. What came up on the screen didn't surprise me, but it confirmed the shape of something I had only partially mapped. 3 lines of credit, 1 joint, 2 in my name alone, the second of which had required a power of attorney to access. Combined balance, $214,000 drawn down over the past 4 months in irregular withdrawals, wire transfers, cashier's checks. 2 large payments to a limited liability company called Coastal Meridian Development Group, LLC. A name I did not recognize until Diane cross-referenced it against Florida state business filings and found it registered to a single managing member. Sterling Reed. She didn't just want the house, I said, more to myself than to Diane. She wanted the insurance policy. Diane stopped typing. I had taken out a substantial life insurance policy 11 years ago, the kind a forensic accountant takes out when he understands, better than most, exactly how quickly financial security can evaporate. Becky was the named beneficiary. She had never shown particular interest in it, or so I had assumed. But Diane pulled the policy record and there it was, a beneficiary change request. Submitted 6 weeks ago, with my forged signature attached. The request had been flagged by the insurer's compliance department as irregular and had not yet been processed, which meant Becky didn't know it had failed. She believed she was already the sole beneficiary of a $1.2 million payout, attached to a man she had been actively trying to convince everyone, including herself perhaps, was in serious cognitive decline. She was covering every exit, Diane said. The house for immediate liquidity, the credit lines for Reed's failing project, and the insurance policy as the long-term backstop, the quiet fortune she would collect when the vascular damage she and Sterling had laughed about finally ran its full course. She had not left me. She had positioned herself to profit from my disappearance in every direction simultaneously. The deed was the visible move. The insurance policy was the one she never expected me to find. I sat down in the chair across from Diane's desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when a complex set of numbers finally resolves, when the variables stop shifting and the equation locks into one definitive answer. I had felt it before in courtrooms, in depositions, in the back rooms of companies whose books had been cooked by people who believed their own sophistication was their protection. The clarity is never satisfying. It is simply clean. The uncertainty ends, and what remains is just the work. I need two things from you, I said to Diane. First, I need a forensic document examiner on the deed by end of day tomorrow. Second, I need you to send a quiet inquiry to Reed's private lender, the one carrying the Coastal Meridian note. Diane made a note on her legal pad. What kind of inquiry? The kind that establishes whether the note is for sale, I said. She looked up at me. You're going to buy his debt. I'm going to buy his debt. She didn't try to talk me out of it. Diane had seen me work long enough to understand that when I move quietly, I move with precision, and when I move with precision, the outcome is already largely decided. She simply wrote it down, underlined it once, and moved on to the next line. We spent the next 2 hours building the evidentiary record, the forged deed, the unauthorized credit draws, the failed insurance modification. Each document went into a sequenced file, not organized for my comfort, but organized for a courtroom. The kind of file that tells a story so clearly, so chronologically, so unambiguously that a judge doesn't have to interpret it. They only have to read it. At one point, Diane leaned back in her chair and said, she thought the power of attorney gave her everything. She used it like a master key, I said. She didn't realize it only opens doors. It doesn't override a trust. Does she know about the trust? I thought about that for a moment, about 17 years of shared dinners and vacations and tax filings and the quiet administrative architecture of a life built for long-term stability. About how many times I had mentioned the trust, referenced it in passing, treated it as background noise the way you treat a smoke detector. Present, functional, uninteresting until the moment it becomes the only thing standing between you and catastrophe. She knew it existed, I said. She didn't think it mattered. She liked the lifestyle, Diane said, almost to herself. But she hated the paperwork. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I finally left Diane's building. The parking lot was empty except for my car and the ambient orange of the streetlights. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The tremor in my right hand had settled. It always did when I was focused, when the clinical part of my mind had fully engaged and taken the wheel. My cardiologist called it paradoxical calm. I called it the only time my body remembered who I actually was. I thought about Becky at the top of that staircase. Composed, deliberate, already emotionally exited from a marriage she had been quietly liquidating for months. I thought about the rosemary smell in the kitchen, a domestic detail, almost tender, preserved in a house she had already signed away in her mind. I thought about Sterling Reed somewhere in Florida or maybe closer, waiting for a wire transfer that would keep his failing development from collapsing entirely, believing that Becky had delivered the deed, the credit lines, the liquidity, and a clear path forward. Believing that the quiet, shaking-handed man who had been removed from the equation had stayed removed. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a text from a number I didn't recognize. You should have just taken the bag and left. This gets harder from here. I read it once. Then I set the phone face down on the seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. He was right about one thing. It was going to get harder. But harder for whom is a question of leverage. And by 4 o'clock the following afternoon, I intended to own the debt that was slowly drowning the man who sent that message, which meant I wouldn't need to make a single threat. I would simply become the most important name on his balance sheet, the one he owed everything to, the one whose terms he would have no choice but to accept. I didn't need to shout. I had the ledger. And the ledger, as it always does, was about to tell the whole truth. I had never been to Miami in October. That's what made the receipt strange at first. Not alarming, just geometrically wrong, the way a number appears in a column where it has no business being. 2 round-trip flights booked through a travel account tied to my personal email, charged to the joint visa ending in 4471. Departure, October 3rd. Return, October 7th. Passenger 1, Rebecca Whitfield. Passenger 2, a name I didn't recognize yet, listed simply as S. Reed. I found them in the downloaded transaction history Diane had pulled during our session, buried between a grocery charge and a routine pharmacy refill, the kind of placement that suggests either carelessness or the particular arrogance of someone who believed the account would never be audited. Becky knew I reviewed our statements quarterly, not monthly. She had timed the trips accordingly, the same way she had timed the deed filing, with the calendar precision of someone who had studied my habits long enough to know exactly where the blind spots were. 4 days in Miami, October 3rd through the 7th. I had been at a rehabilitation facility on October 4th and 5th, working with a physical therapist on fine motor recovery. I had called Becky from the facility both evenings. She had answered both times, her voice warm and slightly tired, telling me she was home, that she'd had dinner with a friend, that she missed me and was proud of how hard I was working. I remember those calls with uncomfortable clarity now, not because they were remarkable, but because they were so convincingly ordinary. She had taken those calls from a hotel room in Miami. I set the transaction record down and opened the second folder Diane had couriered to me that morning, the preliminary background summary on Sterling Reed. It was 11 pages, dense with corporate filings, litigation history, and financial disclosures, and by the 3rd page I understood something that reframed everything Becky had done in the past 4 months. Sterling wasn't a developer, he was a scavenger. The distinction matters enormously in my line of work. A developer builds something, acquires land, secures financing, manages construction, delivers a product. A scavenger finds distressed assets, over-leverages them with other people's capital, extracts whatever short-term value exists, and moves before the structure collapses. Sterling Reed had done this 4 times in 6 years across 3 states, 2 failed condo conversions in Georgia, a mixed-use project in the Carolinas that had gone into receivership 18 months after groundbreaking, and now Coastal Meridian, a 74-unit waterfront development in South Florida that existed primarily as a website, a set of architectural renderings, and a $500,000 note held by a private lender named Harwick Capital Group out of Atlanta. The project had no active permits, no confirmed construction timeline, 14 pre-sale deposits collected from buyers who believed they were investing in a luxury development, when in reality they were funding the operating costs of a man whose previous 3 ventures had each ended with creditors chasing him across state lines. Becky had not fallen in love with a developer. She had fallen in love with the performance of one. The waterfront dinners, the architect's renderings spread across a restaurant table, the casual references to square footage and ocean views and projected returns that sounded, to someone who had spent 17 years watching a forensic accountant organize spreadsheets, like the opposite of everything she had been living. Sterling Reed was fluent in the language of forward momentum. He spoke in futures tense. Everything with him was about what was coming, what was being built, what the landscape would look like once the vision was realized. Becky was terrified of the past tense, of slow recovery, of a husband whose future had become, in her mind, a clinical negotiation rather than a life. I understood her calculus, even as I dismantled it. The $214,000 she had drawn from our credit lines had not gone into Coastal Meridian as an investment. It had gone in as emergency capital to prevent the Harwick note from triggering a default clause. Sterling needed to show consistent debt service to maintain the fiction of the project's viability, to keep the pre-sale buyers from demanding refunds, to keep Harwick from calling the loan and initiating foreclosure proceedings. Becky had become, without fully understanding it, the financial life support system for a project that had been dying since before she met the man running it. She thought she was buying into a future. She was actually subsidizing a collapse. I spent the better part of that morning building Sterling Reed's financial map on paper. The old way, the way I had worked before dual monitors and automated forensic software, with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and the particular satisfaction of watching a pattern emerge from what initially appears to be chaos. Every LLC, every registered agent, every state filing, every disclosed litigation. By noon, I had identified 7 distinct corporate entities connected to Sterling Reed, 5 of which shared a registered address in Delaware, and 2 of which had been administratively dissolved for failure to file annual reports. Coastal Meridian was the cleanest of them, the one he kept presentable for new investors, the one whose website had professional photography and a functioning contact form. The others were husks, empty structures he had used and abandoned as each previous venture had run its course. One entity in particular caught my attention, a holding company called Meridian Shore Partners, LLC, registered 18 months ago with 2 listed members, Sterling Reed and a silent partner identified only through a registered agent, standard practice for privacy, but traceable if you knew which threads to pull. Diane's contact at a business intelligence firm had pulled the underlying operating agreement through a litigation discovery request connected to one of Sterling's Georgia creditors. The silent partner's name, when it finally appeared on page 7 of that agreement, was listed with a capital contribution of $45,000 made in September, 1 month before the Miami flights. The contribution date was September 28th. I had been discharged from the rehabilitation facility on September 22nd. Becky had transferred $45,000 into Sterling Reed's holding company 6 days after bringing me home from recovery. While I was sleeping in our guest room with a blood pressure monitor on my wrist and a medication schedule taped to the bathroom mirror, she had wired nearly half of what she'd drawn from our first credit line into the business account of the man she was already planning to leave me for. I sat with that for a long moment. Not because it wounded me. I had moved past the register of personal injury sometime around the 2nd hour in Diane's office the previous night. What held my attention was the structural audacity of it, the timing, the precision, the way each piece connected to the next with the internal logic of a scheme designed by someone who had convinced themselves they were simply solving a problem. Becky had not acted out of passion or impulse. She had acted out of a cold, quiet fear, and she had channeled that fear into a plan that she believed was airtight. She had not accounted for the fact that she had married the one person professionally trained to find exactly this kind of paper trail. I called Diane at 1:30. "The silent partner in Meridian Shore is Becky," I said. A brief silence. "How much?" $45,000, September 28th. That predates the POA use by 3 weeks. Which means the fraudulent credit draws weren't impulsive, I said. She had already committed capital before she accessed the lines. She needed the credit draws to cover what she'd already moved. She was in deficit before she started, Diane said. Sterling's project is bleeding faster than she anticipated. The Harwick note has a performance covenant. If Coastal Meridian misses 2 consecutive monthly payments, Harwick can accelerate the full $500,000 balance and initiate foreclosure on the project assets. When's the next payment due? 11 days, I said. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear Diane's pen moving across paper. Collins, she said carefully, if someone were to acquire the Harwick note before that payment deadline. They would hold the acceleration right, I said. Yes. And Sterling would have no way of knowing who bought it until the paperwork transferred. Harwick Capital is a private lender. They are not obligated to notify the borrower of a note sale until 30 days post-transfer under the terms of the original agreement. I have already reviewed the agreement. Page 14, Section 8.3. Diane said nothing for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular tone she uses when she has decided something is not just legally viable but strategically elegant. What's your offer to Harwick? Par value plus a 2% premium, I said. They take a clean exit. No default proceedings, no legal costs, no drawn-out recovery process. In exchange, I acquire the note and all rights therein. They'll take it. I know they'll take it. I hung up and looked back at the legal pad in front of me. Sterling Reed's name sat at the center of a web of arrows and dollar figures and corporate designations. A map of someone else's desperation, rendered in pencil on yellow paper. I thought about him in Miami somewhere, in whichever restaurant or hotel lobby he used to perform the role of visionary builder, telling Becky the closing was proceeding smoothly, that the house sale would cover the gap, that everything was moving exactly as planned. He believed he was about to receive a significant cash infusion from the sale of a property he didn't own, funded by a woman who had emptied her husband's credit lines to keep his fiction alive. By 4 o'clock the following afternoon, that same man would have a new boss. And his new boss was going to let him figure that out on his own schedule, quietly, methodically, with no announcement and no warning. The way you discover most things that have already been decided without your knowledge. I didn't want him in jail, not yet. I wanted him on my payroll. There is a particular kind of document that most people sign without reading. Not because they are careless, necessarily, but because the language is dense and the moment is administrative, and the attorney sitting across the table has already explained the broad strokes in plain English, and the broad strokes are all that most people ever need. The details live in the fine print. The fine print lives in the annexes. And the annexes, in most cases, are filed, archived, and never opened again, because the people who sign them assume that the broad strokes will be sufficient for whatever life eventually brings. Becky had signed the trust document on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 12 years ago. I remember the day with the kind of precision I reserve for transactions with long-term consequence. We had driven to the offices of a now-retired estate attorney named Gerald Foss, who had spent 40 minutes walking us through the structure, the tax implications, the revocation limitations, and the specific language governing what could and could not be done with the property once it was transferred into the trust. Becky had asked 2 questions, both about the tax benefit, and had then signed where Gerald indicated with the efficient disinterest of someone completing a formality, rather than executing a binding legal architecture that would govern the most significant asset they owned for the rest of its existence. On the drive home, she had asked what we were doing for dinner. I had placed a certified copy of the fully executed trust document in a fireproof safe in my home office that same evening. I had placed a second copy with Diane. I had noted the trust's existence in my personal financial records, cross-referenced it in my asset protection file, and reviewed it annually as part of my standard end-of-year audit of our holdings. For 12 years, it had sat exactly where I had put it, untouched, unread by anyone but me, doing precisely what an irrevocable trust is designed to do. Waiting. I called Becky on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after finding her note. I did not announce what I was bringing. I simply told her, in a measured and entirely neutral tone, that I needed 30 minutes of her time at the house to collect several items from my office, and that I thought it would be better for both of us if she was present rather than allowing the interaction to occur without her knowledge. She agreed with the careful politeness of someone who believes the hard part is already finished, who has already mentally deposited the proceeds of a sale that hasn't yet closed, and is simply waiting for the remaining logistics to resolve themselves. She met me at the front door. She had given me a temporary access code, a small concession that she likely believed demonstrated reasonable goodwill. The house felt different in the way houses always do when a decision has been made about them, slightly emptied of intent, the furniture and objects carrying the faintly provisional quality of things that have been mentally relocated even while still physically present. We sat at the kitchen table. The crystal paperweight was still on the island. I noticed she had removed the note. I set the folder between us without preamble. "What is this?" she said. "The Whitfield Family Irrevocable Trust," I said. "Established March 14th, 12 years ago. Gerald Foss, attorney of record. Your signature is on page 11, directly below mine." She looked at the folder without opening it. Something moved across her face, not recognition exactly, more the faint discomfort of a name half remembered from a context she had long since stopped considering relevant. "The trust," she said slowly. "We set that up years ago." "We did. For tax purposes." "Partially," I said, "also for asset protection. The property was transferred into the trust at that time. It has been held by the trust continuously since, which means—" "Collins." Her voice had taken on the careful, slightly elevated tone she used when she wanted to redirect a conversation without appearing to do so. "The power of attorney covers asset management." My attorney confirmed. "Your attorney confirmed that a power of attorney grants broad authority over personally held assets," I said. "That's accurate. But the property isn't a personally held asset. It hasn't been for 12 years. The trust is the owner of record. I am the trustee. You are a named beneficiary, but you have no independent authority to transfer, encumber, sell, or otherwise dispose of any trust asset. Neither does a power of attorney, regardless of its scope, because the POA derives its authority from me as an individual. And I, as an individual, have no personal ownership interest in the property to convey." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly down the street. Becky sat across from me with the folder still closed in front of her, and I watched the information arrive in stages, the way complex financial realities always do when presented to someone who has been operating on an incorrect assumption. First, the surface understanding. Then, the structural implication. Then, the full weight of what the implication means for everything built on top of it. "You can't sell what you don't own." "That's not possible," she said finally. Her voice had lost its careful modulation. "The deed transfer was filed. The title company confirmed." "The title company confirmed that a deed was filed," I said. "They did not confirm that the deed was valid. There's a distinction. A forged signature on a fraudulent deed transfer constitutes a void instrument, not a voidable one. It has no legal effect regardless of whether it's been recorded. Recording a void instrument doesn't cure it. It simply creates a public record of a document that was invalid from the moment it was executed." She opened the folder then. I watched her eyes move across the first page, the formal trust language, dense and precise, the kind of prose that had been specifically engineered to foreclose ambiguity. I watched her turn to page 11 and find her own signature next to mine, with Gerald Foss's notary stamp beneath both. She had signed it. She simply hadn't understood what she was signing. She liked the lifestyle, the asset protection, the tax efficiency, the quiet financial stability that the trust had been quietly providing for over a decade. But she had hated the paperwork. And because she had hated the paperwork, she had never returned to it, had never reread it, had never treated it as the binding, consequential, structurally determinative document it actually was. She had filed it mentally under the category of things her husband handled, the same category as the quarterly statements, the insurance reviews, the annual filings that kept their financial life functioning with the invisible reliability of a well-maintained infrastructure. She had not realized that the infrastructure was also a fortress. "The sale is void," I said, not unkindly. "The closing scheduled for next week cannot proceed. The title company will receive formal notice from Diane's office by end of business today, along with a copy of the trust instrument and a cease and desist regarding any further attempts to transfer or encumber the property. The buyers will be notified that the transaction cannot be completed and their deposit will be returned." Becky set the folder down. She was staring at the table. A muscle in her jaw moved once, almost imperceptibly. "The credit lines," she said, and the words came out with the quality of someone testing ground they suspect may no longer be solid. "Are being reviewed for unauthorized use," I said, "along with the beneficiary change request submitted to the insurance carrier in September, which was flagged by their compliance department and not processed. And the deed itself, which a forensic document examiner has now confirmed, was executed with a forged signature and a fraudulent notarization." Each item landed separately, with its own specific gravity. I had not raised my voice. I had not leaned forward or gestured or allowed any of the clinical detachment I was maintaining to slip into something that could be characterized as aggression. I was presenting a financial summary, the kind I had presented hundreds of times in conference rooms and courtrooms and deposition suites, structured, sequential, and irrefutable. Becky looked up from the table. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she was feeling, she was not ready to let it surface in front of me, and I found I respected that even as I recognized it as the same composure she had deployed from the top of the staircase 4 days ago. She had not become a different person. She had simply run out of the particular advantage she had been relying on. "What do you want, Collins?" It was a direct question, and she deserved a direct answer. "I want the fraudulent deed withdrawn," I said. "I want the unauthorized credit draws documented and accounted for in the divorce settlement. I want Diane to handle every subsequent communication between our respective legal teams, and I want the power of attorney formally revoked as of today." I paused. "What I do not want is a protracted legal proceeding that costs both of us considerably more than it resolves. That decision, however, is yours." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the delivery truck had stopped somewhere down the block, and the neighborhood had settled back into its ordinary midweek silence. "You knew," she said finally, not accusatory, almost wondering, "before I filed anything, you already knew." I didn't answer that directly. It wasn't relevant to what needed to happen next, and I had learned a long time ago that confirming the full scope of what you know before you need to is the kind of strategic error that turns a settled ledger back into an open question. What I knew, and what she was only now beginning to understand, was that the sequence of events she had set in motion over the previous 4 months had not unfolded in the vacuum she had assumed. Every wire transfer, every forged document, every carefully timed withdrawal had been leaving traces in systems she had never considered, and those traces had been accumulating, quietly and completely, in a folder that was now sitting open on the kitchen table between us. I stood, collected the trust document, and returned it to the folder. "My attorney will be in contact before 5 o'clock, I said. I picked up my car keys from the counter where her note had been sitting 4 days ago, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Becky's chair shift slightly, and then the sound of her pulling the folder toward her and opening it again, reading it this time, actually reading it with the full, belated attention of someone who had just discovered that the fine print had always been the whole story. I stepped outside into the October air. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A notification from Diane's paralegal, the Harwick Capital Inquiry, had received a response. They were open to a conversation about the note. I had 11 days until Sterling Reed's payment deadline. And somewhere in Miami, he still believed everything was on schedule. Harwick Capital Group occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Atlanta that had been designed to communicate exactly one thing: that the people inside it made consequential decisions about other people's money, and that they were comfortable with that. The receptionist had the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to form opinions about the individuals who came through requesting meetings with the principals. The waiting area had no magazines. Just clean lines, neutral upholstery, and the quiet hum of climate control set slightly cooler than comfortable. A detail I had always interpreted as intentional, a subtle environmental reminder that this was not a place designed for lingering. I had requested the meeting through Diane's office, identifying myself only as a prospective note purchaser with liquidity and a compressed timeline. Harwick's managing director, a compact, precise man named Arthur Greer, had agreed to a same-day appointment with the efficiency of someone whose calendar clears quickly when the words "par value plus premium" appear in the introductory correspondence. He was already seated when I was shown into the conference room. Late 50s, reading glasses on the table beside a manila folder, the careful posture of a man who has spent decades in rooms where the power balance shifts depending on who speaks first. He looked at me the way private lenders always look at prospective buyers of distressed notes, with a neutrality that is actually a very refined form of assessment. We shook hands. I sat down. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "you've reviewed the note summary our office provided." "I have," I said. "I've also reviewed the underlying operating agreement for Coastal Meridian Development Group, the borrower's corporate history across 6 states, the current status of the performance covenants, and the specific acceleration clause triggered by consecutive missed payments." I set my own folder on the table, thinner than his, which I knew would register. Thin folders in rooms like this mean the person holding them has already done the work and is here only to close. The next scheduled payment is in 9 days. Based on the borrower's current liquidity position, that payment will not be made. Greer's expression didn't change, but he removed his reading glasses from the table and set them aside, a small gesture that meant he had decided this conversation was more substantive than preliminary. "You've done considerable due diligence for a prospective buyer with a compressed timeline." "It's a professional habit," I said. "I'm a forensic accountant. I find it difficult to enter a transaction without understanding every number attached to it." "Then you understand the risk profile of the note." "I understand it completely," I said, "which is why I'm not here to negotiate the price downward on the basis of risk. I'm prepared to move at par value plus 2%, cash settlement, within 48 hours of executed transfer documentation. What I need from you in return is a clean assignment, all rights, all covenants, full acceleration authority, and standard notification timing per Section 8.3 of the original loan agreement." Greer looked at me for a moment. Section 8.3 allows 30 days before borrower notification of note transfer. "I'm aware." He understood immediately what 30 days meant in context, and to his credit, he didn't ask me to explain my reasons. Private lenders of Harwick's caliber do not ask buyers why they want what they want. They assess whether the buyer can deliver what they've promised, and if the answer is yes, they move. Asking questions beyond the financial mechanics is not a service they provide. It is also not a risk they take. "The premium," he said, 2% on $500,000 is $10,000. "Correct. You're paying $510,000 for a note on a project with no active permits, 14 unresolved pre-sale commitments, and a borrower with 3 prior venture failures on record." "I am." He picked up his folder and opened it to a page I couldn't read from across the table. He studied it for approximately 15 seconds, then he closed it. We'd want the transfer documentation reviewed by our counsel before execution, he said. Understood. Diane Vance's office will coordinate directly. I'd like to target execution by end of business Thursday. That's achievable, Greer said. He extended his hand across the table. I'll have our counsel reach out to Ms. Vance this afternoon. We shook hands a second time, and the meeting was over in the way that meetings are over when both parties have decided in advance that they want the same outcome. There was no theater, no extended negotiation, no carefully staged hesitation designed to extract a marginally better term. I had come in with a clean offer on a problem Harwick wanted removed from their portfolio, and I had delivered it with enough specificity to make declining it feel imprecise. I was back in my car by 11:15. The 48 hours that followed were administrative in character but surgical in execution. Diane's office and Harwick's counsel worked through the transfer documentation with the efficiency of two firms that understood the value of a compressed timeline. There were 3 rounds of markup, one substantive issue regarding the scope of the acceleration right, which Diane resolved by referencing a precedent from a 2019 Georgia appellate case that the opposing counsel had clearly not anticipated. By Thursday morning, the documentation was clean. I signed the assignment agreement at 2:40 in the afternoon, in the small conference room adjacent to Diane's office. The wire transfer to Harwick's account was confirmed at 3:17. The executed assignment, with all rights and covenants formally transferred, was time-stamped and notarized at 3:51. At 4 o'clock, I owned $500,000 worth of Sterling Reed's debt. I sat in the conference room after Diane's paralegal had collected the documents, looking at the copy of the assignment agreement in front of me. It was a clean, unremarkable document, 4 pages, standard commercial language, no provisions that would attract attention from anyone who came across it without context. Sterling Reed's name appeared on page 1 as the borrower of record. My name appeared on page 3 as the assignee of the note. Between those 2 facts lived a shift in leverage so complete that it had effectively reordered the entire financial reality of the situation. Not with noise or confrontation or the visible drama of a legal filing, but with the quiet, irrevocable logic of a number moving from one column to another. I didn't want him in jail. Not yet, and perhaps not at all, depending on how the next several weeks resolved. Incarceration is an outcome for courtrooms and prosecutors, and I had no interest in ceding that much control over the conclusion of this particular equation. What I wanted was something more precise, not punishment in the abstract, but accountability in the specific. I wanted Sterling Reed to understand, with the full clarity that only financial exposure can produce, that the transaction he had been engineering with my wife's borrowed capital had placed him not in a position of strength, but in a position of complete dependence on a creditor whose identity he did not yet know. I wanted him on my payroll. The psychology of debt is something most people understand only from the borrower's side, the weight of it, the monthly obligation, the quiet anxiety of a liability that doesn't diminish fast enough. What fewer people appreciate is the creditor's position, which is not simply the mirror image of the borrower's burden, but something structurally different. A creditor with acceleration rights and a borrower in default does not merely hold a financial claim. They hold the operational future of whatever the debt was used to build. They can demand immediate full repayment. They can initiate foreclosure on pledged assets. They can, depending on the covenants, insert themselves into business decisions as a condition of forbearance. Sterling Reed had 9 days until his payment deadline. He was already illiquid. The $214,000 Becky had funneled into his operation had not been sufficient to stabilize Coastal Meridian, and with the house sale now formally voided and Diane's cease and desist in the hands of the title company, whatever liquidity Becky had promised him for the closing proceeds no longer existed. He was expecting a wire transfer that was not coming, from a sale that had never been legally possible, on a property he had never actually touched. He did not yet know that his lender had changed. He did not yet know that the man he had helped to erase, the quiet, shaking-handed husband who was supposed to pack a bag and disappear, was now the single most important name in his financial life. Diane appeared in the conference room doorway with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me without asking. She sat down across the table and looked at the assignment agreement for a moment. "How long before he figures it out?" she said. "Harwick's counsel sends the borrower notification letter at the 30-day mark," I said, "which falls 4 days after the scheduled closing at the title company. So he walks into the closing believing the house sale will cover his payment gap, and discovers at the closing that the sale is void," I said, "at which point he has a defaulted note, no incoming capital, and a new creditor he has not yet identified. When does he find out who the new creditor is?" "When I decide to tell him." Diane drank her coffee. Outside the window, Atlanta's late afternoon traffic had begun its slow accumulation on the street below. The light was going amber and horizontal, the particular quality of autumn light in the south that makes everything look slightly more consequential than it might otherwise. "He sent me a text," I said, "the night I left your office after finding the flight receipts, told me it gets harder from here." "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. At that point, I hadn't yet acquired the note. Responding without full leverage would have been imprecise. Diane set her cup down, and now. I looked at the assignment agreement one more time, then closed the folder. "Now the ledger is settled in my favor," I said. "He'll reach out when the payment deadline passes and the capital he was expecting doesn't arrive. When he does, I'll introduce myself properly." "And Becky?" I thought about her at the kitchen table, reading the trust document with the delayed attention of someone discovering that a contract they signed 17 years ago had been protecting someone else's interests the entire time. I thought about the rosemary smell in the kitchen and the crystal paperweight and the 2 words I had written on the back of her note. "Becky," I said, "is beginning to understand the scope of what she didn't read." My phone lit up on the table. A number I recognized, the same one that had sent the text 4 days ago, the one I had set face down on the passenger seat without responding to. A call this time, not a message. Sterling Reed, applying pressure he believed he still had the capacity to apply, reaching out to a man he thought he had successfully removed from the equation. I watched the screen for 3 full rings. Then I declined the call, picked up my coffee, and looked out the window at the city going gold in the afternoon light. He would call again. They always did when the numbers stopped working in their favor. And when he did, I would answer. The title company occupied a low, professional building on the west side of town, the kind of address that exists in every mid-sized city, understated and functional, with a parking lot full of sedans, and a lobby that smells of new carpet and the particular neutrality of a space designed to make large financial transactions feel routine. I had been in dozens of rooms like it over the course of my career, usually representing a client whose interests were being clarified rather than executed. This was the first time I had arrived as the clarification itself. I was 40 minutes early. I sat in my car and watched the lot fill incrementally. The buyers arrived first, a couple in their early 40s, the woman in a camel coat, the man checking his phone with the distracted energy of someone running a parallel mental calculation about furniture placement in school districts. They had no idea. That was the most important thing to hold clearly as I watched them walk toward the entrance. They were not participants in the fraud. They were its intended instrument, the mechanism through which Becky and Sterling had planned to convert a property they didn't own into cash they desperately needed. Whatever was about to happen to them in the next hour was not something they had designed or deserved, and I had asked Diane to ensure that their deposit would be returned without complication before the day was out. Sterling's car arrived 17 minutes later. A leased model, current year, the kind of vehicle chosen for the impression it creates rather than the utility it provides. He stepped out with the practiced ease of a man who treats every entrance as a minor performance: dark jacket, open collar, a leather portfolio under his arm that I recognized from Diane's surveillance photographs as the one he carried to investor meetings. He was taller than I had expected. That detail is irrelevant, but details have a way of becoming concrete when a person you have known only through financial documents materializes in a parking lot 40 feet from your windshield. He didn't look toward my car. Becky arrived 4 minutes after Sterling in her own vehicle, and they did not acknowledge each other in the parking lot. They had agreed to maintain the appearance of a straightforward principal and agent transaction, Becky as the authorized seller under the power of attorney, Sterling as a facilitating party rather than a disclosed interested buyer. It was a thin fiction, the kind that functions only as long as no one in the room has the documentation to contradict it. I gave them 8 minutes to settle inside. Then I got out of the car. The room went cold when I walked in. Not immediately and not all at once, more the way temperature drops when a window opens, a gradual recalibration that begins at the edges and moves inward. The receptionist looked up with professional neutrality. The buyer's attorney, seated at the near end of the conference table, registered my entrance with a quick assessment and then looked toward Becky for context. Becky, who had been mid-sentence when the door opened, stopped speaking. The stillness that moved across her face was not shock exactly, more the specific quality of someone whose carefully maintained composure has just encountered a variable they had not included in their preparation. Sterling, seated to her right, looked at me with the calibrated steadiness of a man who has spent years in rooms where appearing unrattled is a professional survival skill. He was good at it. I gave him that. The title officer, a measured woman named Patricia Holt, who had clearly been briefed on the transaction's basic structure, looked between me and Becky with the alert caution of someone who has presided over enough closings to recognize when a room has shifted from routine to complicated. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today." "I wasn't aware I needed to announce it," I said pleasantly. "It's my property." I set my briefcase on the table and took the chair at the far end, directly opposite the buyer's, which placed Becky and Sterling in my peripheral vision without requiring me to look at either of them directly. The buyer's attorney had his pen in his hand and a slight furrow between his eyebrows that suggested he was already reconstructing the transaction's architecture in light of my presence. "Collins." Becky's voice was controlled, but the register was slightly elevated, the particular pitch of someone managing their composure with active effort rather than natural ease. "This is not." "Diane," I said. Diane entered 30 seconds behind me, as arranged, carrying a document portfolio and the particular expression she reserves for rooms where she intends to end an argument rather than begin one. She had dressed accordingly, dark suit, nothing superfluous. She set the portfolio on the table beside mine and remained standing. "Ms. Vance," Patricia Holt said carefully, "are you representing Mr. Whitfield?" "I am," Diane said, "and I believe my office forwarded a cease and desist to this title company 4 days ago regarding the proposed transfer of the property located at." She cited the address with the flat precision of someone reading a legal instrument, on the basis that the property is held in irrevocable trust and cannot be conveyed by any individual signatory, regardless of any power of attorney purporting to grant such authority. Patricia Holt's expression had shifted into the careful neutrality of a professional who is quietly grateful that someone else is articulating the problem she had already identified. "We did receive that correspondence," she said. "I had intended to address it with all parties before proceeding." "We'd appreciate that," Diane said, beginning with the confirmation that this closing cannot proceed. The check was on the table, the buyer's certified funds. positioned near the title officer's materials in the standard arrangement of a transaction expected to close within the hour. It sat there with the clean, inert authority of a document that has not yet been told it serves no purpose. The buyers were looking at their attorney, who was looking at the cease and desist copy that Diane had extracted from her portfolio and slid across the table with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has already won and is simply completing the paperwork. Sterling spoke then. His voice was even calibrated, the voice of a man who has talked his way out of difficult rooms before and believes this one is no different. "I think there's been a miscommunication," he said. "The power of attorney was properly executed and notarized. We have documentation." "You have a forged deed," I said, not loudly, just clearly the way you state a numerical fact, executed with a fabricated signature and a notarization stamp from a county 2 states away. The forensic document examiner's report is in the portfolio. Page 4, if you'd like to review the specific findings. The room absorbed that. Sterling's jaw didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He looked at Becky. Becky was looking at the table. Her lipstick, I noticed with the detached observational clarity that accompanies moments of genuine focus, had smeared very slightly at the left corner, the kind of detail that surfaces when composure has been under sustained pressure for longer than it was built to hold. She had walked in believing today was the day the transaction completed, the day the capital transferred, the day the plan she had been constructing for months resolved into a clean, forward-moving reality. I watched her understand, across the span of about 4 seconds, that none of that was happening. "The check was on the table," I said, addressing Patricia Holt rather than anyone else. "But the house has been off the market since the moment the fraudulent deed was filed. The trust instrument predates the power of attorney, predates the deed, and predates any claim of authority that any party in this room has attempted to exercise over the property. The sale is void. The buyer's deposit should be returned in full, as they are entirely without fault in this matter." The buyer's attorney was already leaning toward his clients, speaking quietly. The woman in the camel coat had stopped looking at the table and was now looking at Sterling with an expression that I recognized, the expression of someone reassessing a sequence of events they had previously accepted at face value. Her husband had put his phone away. Patricia Holt looked at the cease and desist, then at the trust document Diane had placed beside it, then at the forensic report. She was doing what competent title officers do when a transaction has been revealed as legally unsupportable. She was building the paper record of why the closing did not proceed, because the paper record is what protects a title company when the litigation arrives later. "Given the documentation presented," she said carefully, "I don't believe we can proceed with this closing today. I'll need to place the buyer's funds in escrow pending resolution of the title issues, and I'd recommend all parties consult with their respective counsel before." "We've already consulted," Diane said, "extensively." Sterling stood. It was a controlled movement, the kind designed to signal that he is choosing to exit rather than being removed, and it would have been more effective if his portfolio hadn't slipped slightly as he rose, requiring a quick adjustment that briefly undermined the composure the gesture was meant to convey. He looked at me for the first time directly, a long, assessing look with the specific quality of someone deciding how much of what they know to reveal. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He held my gaze for another moment, then picked up his portfolio and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click, quieter than a slam and somehow more final because of it. Becky hadn't moved. She was still seated, looking at the trust document that Diane had placed in front of her, the same document she had sat with at the kitchen table 4 days ago, reading it with the full and belated attention it had always deserved. Her attorney, a man I had not seen before today, leaned toward her and said something in a low voice. She shook her head slightly, the gesture of someone declining comfort rather than information. Patricia Holt was already making notes. The buyer's attorney was guiding his clients toward the door with the practiced efficiency of someone extracting people from a situation that has become legally complex and personally uncomfortable. The woman in the camel coat looked back once as she reached the doorway, not at me, not at Becky, but at the check still sitting on the table beside the title officer's materials. The funds she had brought to purchase a home that was never available for purchase. When the buyers had gone, the room held only me, Diane, Becky, and her attorney. Patricia Holt had stepped into the adjacent office to begin the escrow documentation. The overhead lighting felt slightly flatter than it had when the room was full. Becky looked up at me. Her eyes were steady, which I respected. Whatever she was feeling, and I understood that the emotional register of this moment was considerably more complex for her than the financial one. She was not prepared to let it surface here, in this room, in front of an audience that now included her own attorney and the husband she had underestimated. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," I said, "your attorney and Diane begin the conversation about terms, and Sterling discovers that the capital he was expecting is not coming. He'll go after you," she said, "not as a threat, more as information, the kind offered by someone who knows a person's tendencies from proximity. He doesn't absorb losses quietly." "I know," I said, "I'm counting on it." I picked up my briefcase. Diane was already repacking her portfolio with the efficient finality of someone who has completed the task they arrived to complete. I buttoned my jacket, nodded once to Becky's attorney, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Becky exhale, a single, quiet breath, the kind that carries the weight of something finally, irrevocably concluded. I did not turn around. In the parking lot, Sterling's leased car was gone. My phone showed one missed call from the same number I had declined in Diane's office 3 days ago, and a text sent 11 minutes ago. While he was still in the building, still in the room, still performing steadiness for an audience that was no longer watching. The text read, "We need to talk, name a number." I stood beside my car in the flat October light and looked at the message for a moment. Sterling Reed, whose $500,000 note I had owned for 72 hours, was asking the man he didn't know was his creditor to name a price for standing down. I put the phone in my pocket. He didn't need a number. He needed a reckoning, and the instrument of that reckoning was already in motion, scheduled to arrive in the form of a 30-day notification letter from Harwick Capital Group's former counsel, informing the borrower of record that his note had been assigned, and that his new creditor would be in touch regarding the terms of the outstanding default. The terms, when I delivered them, would be simple, measured, and entirely non-negotiable. I started the car and pulled out of the lot. The recording existed because of a software update I had approved 14 months ago without giving it particular thought. The vehicle, a late-model sedan I had purchased primarily for its adaptive cruise control and the ergonomic benefit of its driver's seat during long highway commutes, had received an over-the-air firmware update that expanded its onboard data logging capabilities. The update included continuous ambient audio capture during active Bluetooth pairing sessions, a feature designed ostensibly for hands-free call quality optimization, with a rolling retention window of 90 days stored locally on the vehicle's internal drive. The documentation was 12 pages long. I had read all of it, flagged the privacy implications as a data point worth monitoring, and moved on. Becky had been using the car twice a week while I was in rehabilitation. She had driven it to the grocery store, to her sister's house, to the salon, and on at least 3 occasions confirmed by the vehicle's GPS log, she had driven it to a hotel 11 miles from our home, where Sterling Reed had been staying during his visits to finalize what he believed was the acquisition of our property. She had made those calls through the car's Bluetooth system. She did not realize the car remembers every conversation. I had pulled the audio files myself, 2 weeks before the closing, using the vehicle manufacturer's diagnostic software, and a cable I had ordered online for $42. The process had taken about 20 minutes and had produced 11 audio files of varying length, most of them fragmentary, partial conversations, where the Bluetooth had connected mid-call, ambient road noise cutting in and out beneath the voices. 7 of the files were routine. Calls to her sister, a conversation with a contractor about bathroom tile, a lengthy exchange with someone from her book club about a restaurant reservation. 3 of the files were not routine. The most significant was recorded on a Tuesday evening in late September, 3 days after Becky had wired $45,000 into Sterling's holding company, 1 week before she filed the fraudulent deed. 41 minutes of continuous audio, the Bluetooth connection established before the engine had fully warmed up, capturing the entire conversation from departure to arrival with the indiscriminate thoroughness of a system that does not make editorial decisions about what is worth preserving. I had listened to it once in its entirety, alone in Diane's conference room with the door closed, and I had not listened to it again. Once was sufficient to understand what it contained. Once was sufficient to understand that the woman I had been married to for 17 years had sat in my car and discussed my life expectancy with a man she was funding with my money, in a tone that suggested the conversation was neither new nor uncomfortable for either of them. I wasn't dying fast enough for them. That is not a reconstruction or an inference. That is a paraphrase of language that appears, with greater specificity and considerably less clinical distance, in the 41st minute of a 41-minute recording. Sterling's voice, relaxed and unhurried, his assessment of my vascular situation and the timeline it implied, framed not as medical concern but as a scheduling consideration. Becky's response, quieter but audible, was not a correction. It was an agreement dressed in softer language, the kind that maintains plausible deniability while confirming the underlying position. They were not discussing whether I would recover. They were discussing how long recovery was likely to delay outcomes they had already decided were inevitable. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of November, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the county courthouse that smelled of old wood and central heating, running slightly too warm for the season. Judge Halpern, mid-60s, rimless glasses, the economical manner of someone who has presided over enough hearings to have permanently compressed her tolerance for theatrics, had reviewed the preliminary filings and had granted Diane's motion to consolidate the deed fraud, the unauthorized POA use, and the insurance beneficiary modification into a single civil proceeding. Becky's attorney was a competent man named Aldrich, who had spent the preceding 2 weeks attempting to reframe his client's actions as a series of good-faith decisions made under reasonable interpretations of the power of attorney's scope. It was a coherent argument, carefully structured, and it would have been more persuasive if the forensic document examiner's report hadn't already established that the deed's signature was fabricated, and if the insurance beneficiary change request hadn't been submitted while I was physically in a rehabilitation facility with a documented daily schedule that made my personal participation in any notarized transaction geographically impossible. Aldrich was building a case on sand, and he knew it. His courtroom posture had the particular quality of an attorney who is managing expectations rather than pursuing a result. Diane had structured our presentation in 4 sequential movements: the trust instrument, the forensic findings, the financial documentation, and the recording. She had debated the sequencing with me at length over 2 sessions in the week prior, whether to lead with the recording for maximum impact, or to build toward it so that by the time Judge Halpern heard the audio, the factual foundation was already so thoroughly established that the recording functioned not as a revelation, but as a confirmation. We built toward it. The recording was always going to be the last thing they heard. The first 90 minutes of the hearing proceeded with the measured rhythm of a proceeding where the evidentiary record is dense, and the legal questions, while significant, are not particularly ambiguous. Diane walked Judge Halpern through the trust instrument with the methodical patience of someone who respects a judge's time enough to be thorough without being repetitive. The forensic document examiner, a composed woman named Dr. Addisa, testified for 35 minutes about the specific markers of fabrication in the deed signature, pen pressure, letter formation, ink composition inconsistent with the notarization date. Aldrich's cross-examination produced nothing that altered her conclusions. The financial documentation consumed another 40 minutes. Credit line draws, wire transfer records, the coastal meridian connection, the insurance modification request. Each document entered into evidence with its corresponding chain of custody. Aldrich objected to 2 exhibits on foundation grounds. Judge Halpern overruled both with the brevity of someone who has read the briefs and is not discovering anything new. Becky sat at the respondent's table in a charcoal suit, composed and still, with the posture of someone who has been coached to project stability. She had lost weight since October. Her eyes, when they moved across the courtroom, carried the particular quality of someone performing a continuous damage assessment, measuring each piece of evidence not for its truth value, but for its impact on the outcome she was trying to minimize. Sterling was not present. He had retained separate counsel who had filed a motion for continuance that Judge Halpern had denied. His absence was noted in the record. When Diane stood to introduce the final exhibit, the room had the specific quality of a space in which everyone present understands that something conclusive is about to occur, even if they don't yet know precisely what form it will take. "Your Honor," Diane said, "the petitioner's final exhibit is an audio recording recovered from the onboard data storage of a vehicle registered to Collins Whitfield, capturing a conversation occurring on September 24th between Rebecca Whitfield and Sterling Reed, conducted via Bluetooth through the vehicle's integrated communication system. The recording has been authenticated by a digital forensics specialist whose written certification is included in the exhibit documentation. With the court's permission, we'd like to play a portion of the recording, specifically, the segment beginning at the 38th minute." Judge Halpern looked at Aldrich, counsel. Aldrich had reviewed the recording in discovery. He knew what was on it. His objection, relevance, prejudicial impact was technically required and substantively futile, and the brevity with which he delivered it suggested he understood both of those things simultaneously. Judge Halpern overruled it in approximately 4 seconds and nodded at Diane to proceed. The courtroom speakers were modest, the standard audio system of a working courtroom, not engineered for fidelity. But the recording was clear enough. Road noise as a baseline, the particular acoustic quality of a car interior, and then 2 voices, unmistakable and unguarded, speaking with the casual ease of people who believe they are alone. Sterling's voice first, discussing my neurological prognosis with the confident imprecision of someone who has absorbed fragments of medical information and deployed them in service of a preferred conclusion. The word progressive, used incorrectly but purposefully. A reference to a timeline, months, not years, delivered not as a concern but as a planning parameter. And then Becky's voice, quieter but present. She did not correct him. She did not push back on the timeline or the characterization or the casual certainty with which a man who had never met my cardiologist was projecting the arc of my recovery. She responded in the way people respond when a conversation has covered this ground before, and both parties have arrived at a shared position, with the comfortable shorthand of an agreement that no longer requires full articulation. I was watching Judge Halpern while the recording played. She was looking at the speaker on the courtroom wall with the focused, neutral attention of someone absorbing evidence rather than reacting to it. Her pen was still. Whatever she was thinking it entirely internally, which is the judicial equivalent of a very specific kind of attention. At the table across from Diane, Becky had gone very still. Not the composed stillness of the preceding 2 hours, the deliberate, coached stillness of someone managing their presentation under sustained pressure. This was something different. This was the stillness of a person hearing something return to them that they had believed was gone. A conversation spoken in a moving car on a Tuesday evening in September, in a vehicle whose capabilities they had not considered, about a man whose mind they had underestimated in nearly every direction simultaneously. The recording ended. The courtroom held the specific silence that follows something that cannot be unheard. Judge Halpern set her pen down on her notepad and looked at Aldrich with the expression of someone extending a professional courtesy before delivering an outcome. Does the respondent wish to address Exhibit 7? Aldrich stood. He spoke for 4 minutes. He was precise, measured, and entirely unable to alter the fundamental nature of what the room had just heard. When he sat down, the quality of the silence was different from before, heavier, more settled, the silence of a proceeding that has found its conclusion and is simply completing the remaining formalities. Judge Halpern made several notes. She asked Diane 2 clarifying questions about the chain of custody documentation and the digital forensics certification. Diane answered both without consulting her files. Then Judge Halpern looked at the courtroom with the calm, measured expression of someone about to do exactly what the evidence requires. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," she said. "When we return, I'll deliver my findings on the preliminary motions and address the question of interim injunctive relief." The gavel came down with a sound that was quieter than I had expected, or perhaps the room had simply gotten very quiet around it. Bailiffs moved. Attorneys gathered papers. The ambient sound of a courtroom returning to motion filled the space where the recording had been. I looked at Becky. She was still seated, her attorney's hand on her forearm, speaking to her in a low and urgent voice. She wasn't listening to him. She was looking at the speaker on the wall, the modest, institutional speaker through which her own voice had just been played back to her in a room full of people, in a building designed specifically for the purpose of establishing what is and isn't true. Diane appeared at my elbow. "She's going to want to settle," she said quietly. "I know," I said. "Before Halpern comes back." "I know," I said again. My phone, set to silent in my jacket pocket, vibrated once. I didn't check it. Whatever message had arrived could wait until the recess was over and Judge Halpern had returned to deliver findings that were, at this point, a formality. I had spent 31 years in the business of following paper trails to their conclusions. I had sat in rooms where the evidence spoke more clearly than any witness, where the numbers made arguments that no attorney could improve upon, where the truth of a transaction revealed itself not through confrontation, but through documentation assembled with patience and precision. This room was no different. The only variable I had not fully accounted for was the sound of Becky's voice coming through that speaker, familiar and distant simultaneously. The voice of a person I had known for nearly 2 decades, reduced in 41 minutes of Tuesday evening audio to something I no longer recognized as the woman I had married. The tremor in my right hand had been completely still all morning. Judge Halpern returned to the bench at 11:47. The 15-minute recess had stretched to 22, which Diane had noted without comment, but with the particular quality of attention she reserves for details that carry procedural significance. Judges who return late from recesses following evidentiary presentations are generally not returning to deliver narrow or preliminary findings. They are returning having made a decision, not just about the immediate motion, but about the shape of the proceeding going forward, and they have taken the additional time to ensure the language of that decision is precise enough to withstand appeal. Aldrich had used the recess to speak with Becky at length, his body angled toward her in the urgent posture of an attorney recalibrating expectations in real time. Whatever he had said, she had received it with the contained stillness of someone who has passed through the acute phase of a shock and arrived at something flatter and more enduring on the other side. She was seated straight, hands folded on the table, her charcoal suit immaculate in the way that expensive tailoring remains immaculate regardless of what is happening inside it. She had walked into this building this morning as a respondent in a civil proceeding, a categorization that, while serious, carries a certain procedural distance from consequence. By the time Judge Halpern finished speaking, that distance would be considerably reduced. She walked in a socialite, she would walk out a defendant. The courtroom settled the moment Judge Halpern's chair moved. That particular quality of collective attention, the specific silence of a room that has been waiting and now understands the wait is over, filled the space with the compressed stillness of something about to be released. Judge Halpern opened her notepad, reviewed her top page once without expression, and then looked up at the room with the precise, deliberate focus of someone who intends every word that follows to be heard without ambiguity. This court has reviewed the petitioner's motion for preliminary injunctive relief and the consolidated evidentiary submission regarding the fraudulent conveyance of real property, the unauthorized exercise of a durable power of attorney, and the attempted modification of a life insurance beneficiary designation. I will address each in turn. She paused not for effect, but with the rhythmic deliberateness of a jurist who speaks in paragraphs rather than sentences. Regarding the property transfer, the evidence is unambiguous. The subject property has been held continuously within an irrevocable trust instrument for a period of 12 years. The trust documentation, executed by both parties and notarized by a licensed attorney of record, predates all subsequent instruments by a margin that admits no legitimate interpretation favoring the respondent's claimed authority. The deed transfer filed on October 3rd is hereby declared void ab initio, void from its inception, without legal effect, and is ordered expunged from the county property record within 10 business days. The title company is directed to return the buyer's escrow funds in full, without condition or offset. The buyer's attorney, seated in the gallery behind us, made a brief notation. The buyers themselves were not present. They had been notified of the hearing date but had declined to attend, which I had understood as the decision of people who wanted their money returned and wished to have no further association with any aspect of this transaction. Regarding the power of attorney, this court finds that the instrument was exercised materially outside the scope of its intended authority, and that the respondent's use of said instrument to access joint and individual credit facilities constitutes unauthorized financial manipulation. The power of attorney is hereby revoked with immediate effect. Any financial institution that has received documentation purporting to authorize transactions under this instrument is ordered to freeze such activity pending further court directive. The petitioner's counsel is directed to serve this order on all relevant financial institutions within 48 hours. Aldrich was writing steadily. His pen moved without pause, the documentation reflex of an attorney who has accepted that the proceeding is no longer about altering the outcome, but about building the record for whatever comes next. Regarding the insurance beneficiary modification, the court notes that the beneficiary change request was not successfully processed due to the insurer's independent compliance review. Nevertheless, the submission of a forged signature on an insurance document constitutes a fraudulent act independent of whether the modification was ultimately effectuated. This finding will be referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal liability. That last sentence arrived in the room with a weight distinct from everything preceding it. Civil findings carry financial and injunctive consequence. A referral to the district attorney carries a different category of implication entirely, one that does not resolve in a settlement agreement or a negotiated decree, but in a process that Becky and her attorney would have no control over once it was initiated. The gavel sounds different when it's ending a marriage. I had expected something more dramatic, some internal register of finality commensurate with the scope of what was being concluded. What I felt instead was the particular clarity that follows the resolution of a complex equation. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the clean, quiet recognition that the numbers have landed where the evidence always indicated they would. The process had been meticulous. The outcome was its logical extension. I looked at Becky once, not to observe her reaction, but because 17 years of shared history creates a kind of gravitational obligation to witness a moment of this magnitude rather than look away from it. She was looking at Judge Halpern with the fixed attention of someone absorbing each sentence individually, translating legal language into personal consequence in real time. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She had not broken during the recording, and she did not break now, and I found that I did not want her to. Whatever Becky was, whatever she had become in the months preceding October, she was not a woman who collapsed in public, and the dignity of that, even here, even now, was something I acknowledged without softening anything that surrounded it. Judge Halpern continued for another 6 minutes, addressing the procedural timeline for the divorce proceedings, the appointment of a forensic accountant, someone from outside our professional network, appropriately, to audit the full scope of the credit line draws and trace every dollar of the unauthorized transfers. She set a compliance hearing for 60 days out and directed both parties to submit financial disclosure affidavits within 30 days. Then she looked up from her notepad with the expression of someone who has one remaining thing to say and intends to say it without procedural scaffolding. The court is troubled by the nature of the conduct documented in this proceeding, the exploitation of a spouse's medical vulnerability, specifically, the use of a period of neurological recovery to obtain a coerced instrument and execute a coordinated scheme of financial fraud, represents a particularly serious breach of both legal and ethical obligation. This court will not characterize that breach as merely technical. The referral to the district attorney's office reflects this court's view that the conduct documented here warrants scrutiny beyond the civil remedy. She closed her notepad. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down. The room exhaled. Aldrich was on his feet immediately, moving toward Becky with the purposeful efficiency of an attorney who needs to manage his client's next 45 minutes with considerable care. He placed a hand on her forearm, the same gesture as the recess, but carrying different weight now, and spoke to her quietly and rapidly, the words too low to carry across the room. Becky nodded twice. She was already gathering her things with the precise, economical movements of someone operating on a kind of controlled autopilot, performing the mechanics of departure, while the larger architecture of what had just occurred settled around her. Diane was beside me. "The DA referral is significant," she said, her voice low. "I know. Aldrich will push for a plea arrangement that keeps it civil. He'll want to negotiate the criminal exposure into the divorce settlement terms." "Let him," I said. "The settlement terms are already drafted. He'll find them reasonable given the alternative." She looked at me with the measured assessment she reserves for moments when she is deciding whether to say the next thing or let it stand unsaid. She let it stand. I picked up my briefcase and buttoned my jacket. Around us, the courtroom was moving through its post-proceeding rhythms, clerks collecting documents, the court reporter reviewing her transcript, the bailiff returning to his station, with the unhurried manner of a man for whom judicial proceedings are the texture of an ordinary workday rather than a singular event. In the doorway of the courtroom, Becky paused. She did not look back at the bench or at Diane, or at the table where the evidentiary record of the preceding 4 months had been systematically entered into the permanent legal record. She looked at me. A long, direct look, unmediated by the composure she had been maintaining for the past 3 hours, carrying something that was not quite remorse and not quite accusation, but existed in the space between them. The complex register of a person who has arrived at a consequence they engineered themselves, and is only now fully understanding the distance between what they planned and where they have landed. I held her gaze. Aldrich touched her elbow. She turned and walked out. The corridor sounds reached us briefly as the door opened and closed, footsteps, distant voices, the ambient noise of a courthouse in operation, and then the courtroom returned to its working quiet. I was the last to leave. Diane had gone ahead to coordinate with her paralegal on the financial institution notifications. The clerks had finished their work. The room was empty in the specific way that rooms are empty after something conclusive has occurred within them. Not neutral, but spent, carrying the residual weight of the proceeding like a hall after a storm has moved through it. I stood at the table for a moment, the chair where Becky had been sitting, the speaker on the wall that had returned her voice to her, the notepad where Judge Halpern had written the findings that would now govern the dissolution of a marriage, the recovery of assets, and the referral of a criminal matter to a process neither Becky nor I would have any further control over. My phone showed 2 missed calls from a number I recognized. Sterling Reed, who had been absent from these proceedings, had called once during the recess and once during Judge Halpern's findings. The timing of the second call suggesting he had received some form of notification about how the hearing was proceeding, and had responded by attempting to reach me with the urgency of someone whose remaining options are narrowing in real time. He did not yet know that the 30-day notification letter from Harwick Capital's former counsel had been mailed 4 days ago. He did not yet know that the letter named me as his new creditor, that the default clause had been triggered by the missed payment, and that I held full acceleration rights on a $500,000 note attached to a project that had no permits, no capital, and no incoming revenue from a house sale that a judge had just formally declared void. He would know all of this within 48 hours, when the letter arrived and the certified mail receipt came back signed. I walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, past the elevator bank where Aldrich and Becky were waiting in the careful silence of an attorney and client who have run out of immediate things to say to each other, and toward the stairwell at the far end of the hall. I took the stairs. 4 flights down, the lobby doors opened onto the November air, cold and clean and carrying the particular quality of late autumn in this part of the country, the smell of dried leaves and cooling concrete, and the distant metallic undertone of weather still several weeks away. I stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street. Somewhere across the city, Sterling Reed was dialing my number for the 3rd time, applying pressure with the persistent energy of a man who still believed pressure was a tool available to him. He did not yet know that the instrument he had been counting on, Becky's capital, the fraudulent sale, the manufactured vulnerability of a husband who was supposed to have been too diminished to respond, had been systematically dismantled over the preceding 6 weeks with the same methodical precision he had mistaken for passivity. He was about to find out what it meant to owe everything to the person you helped to erase. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. February arrives differently when you are no longer performing a life. That is the only way I can describe the first genuinely quiet period I had experienced in longer than I could accurately measure. Not the enforced stillness of a rehabilitation facility, where quiet is a clinical prescription rather than a chosen condition, but the organic silence of a life that has been reduced to its essential components, and found, in that reduction, something that functions better than what preceded it. The lake house had been in my name alone since its purchase 9 years ago, a weekend property that Becky had visited occasionally, but never considered significant enough to incorporate into her planning. It had 2 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, a dock that needed a board replaced on the eastern side, and a view of the water that changed character approximately every 40 minutes as the winter light moved across it. I had been living there full-time for 11 weeks. The divorce had been finalized on the 14th of January, in a proceeding that lasted less time than the average quarterly earnings review I had conducted for corporate clients over the preceding 2 decades. Aldrich had negotiated competently within the constraints his client's documented conduct had imposed on him, which is to say, he had worked within a very narrow corridor and had extracted what he could from the margins. The settlement terms Diane had drafted held in their essential structure. The trust assets remained intact and entirely in my control. The credit line draws were documented as unauthorized withdrawals, offset against Becky's share of the jointly held liquid assets, which left her with considerably less than she had anticipated when she had first begun constructing her exit strategy in the summer. The criminal referral remained open. The district attorney's office had accepted the matter for review and had been in contact with Diane on 3 occasions since the civil hearing. The timeline of that process was no longer mine to influence or accelerate. It belonged to a system that moved at its own pace, for its own reasons, and I had made my peace with that the same way I make peace with any variable I cannot control, by removing it from the active portion of my attention and allowing it to resolve in its own time. Sterling Reed had lasted in the state for approximately 6 weeks following the failed closing. The certified letter from Harwick Capital's former counsel had arrived at his registered business address 8 days after the civil hearing, nomming me as the assignee of his $500,000 note and formally notifying him of the existing default and my right to accelerate the full balance. The phone call that followed, the one I had answered on the courthouse steps, had been precisely what I expected. Controlled alarm beneath a surface of negotiation, the voice of a man attempting to assess an opponent's position while concealing the full extent of his own exposure. I had been unhurried on that call. I had listened more than I spoke, which is almost always the correct approach when the other party is simultaneously trying to project strength and calculate retreat. Sterling had proposed 3 different arrangements in the space of 12 minutes, a payment plan, a partial settlement, a proposed restructuring of the Coastal Meridian note into a new vehicle with revised terms. Each proposal was the financial equivalent of someone rearranging furniture in a burning building. The underlying problem, that he had no capital, no incoming revenue, a project with no viable path to completion, and 14 pre-sale depositors who were now represented by an attorney filing a separate civil action, was not addressable through restructuring. I had told him I would review his proposals and respond through Diane's office within 10 business days. I had then filed for acceleration of the full note balance, initiated a UCC lien search on every asset connected to his 7 corporate entities, and placed a formal hold on the only piece of collateral the original Harwick agreement had specified, a parcel of undeveloped land in coastal Georgia that Sterling had been carrying on his books at an optimistic valuation that bore only a passing relationship to its appraised market value. He had retained an attorney. The attorney had sent 3 letters. Diane had responded to each with the particular economy of language she reserves for correspondence she considers more performative than substantive. By the end of January, Sterling's attorney had stopped writing letters and Sterling himself had stopped calling. A contact at a title company in Dade County, someone Diane knew professionally, confirmed in the first week of February that Sterling Reed had recently appeared in the South Florida property records in connection with a new LLC registered at a Miami Beach address. He had not resolved the Georgia lien. He had not settled the note. He had simply moved, as scavengers do when the terrain is exhausted, to a new location where the prior damage is not immediately visible and the performance can begin again for a fresh audience. I had expected this. I had not attempted to prevent it. The legal mechanisms pursuing him, the civil action from the depositors, the accelerated note, the Georgia lien, the open criminal referral would follow him at their own pace with their own momentum, and they would arrive with the accumulated weight of documentation that does not diminish with distance. My professional involvement was largely complete. What remained was administrative, and Diane's office would manage it without requiring my daily attention. What I had not expected was the voicemail. It arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of February, deposited at 2:14 a.m. while I was asleep. I saw the notification when I woke at 6:30, a local number I didn't recognize, which meant a new phone, a prepaid perhaps, or a number registered at a new address. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. I made coffee before I listened to it, standing at the kitchen window looking at the lake in the early gray light, the water flat and pewter-colored, and absolutely still in the way that cold water is still. Then I played it. Becky's voice, without the silk blouse and the chandelier light and the managed composure of every previous interaction since October, sounds like a person who has been awake for a long time. Not distressed in the acute, dramatic register that the word distress usually implies, more worn, reduced, the particular vocal quality of someone who has been sitting alone, with something heavy for long enough that the effort of maintaining the performance has simply become unsustainable. She had been living in a furnished apartment for 6 weeks. She mentioned it not as complaint but as orientation, placing herself in a geography that was as far from the house on the Maple Line Street as it was possible to be while remaining in the same city. Her sister had helped her with the deposit. The designer wardrobe she had maintained with the careful attention of someone for whom appearance was a form of armor had been partially liquidated in January. A detail she mentioned with the flat affect of someone reporting a weather condition rather than a loss. Sterling had left. She said it simply, without elaboration, in the tone of someone reporting a fact they had known was coming long enough that the arrival of it contained no genuine surprise. Only the specific quality of a thing feared finally materializing and being, in its materialization, less dramatic than the anticipation had been. He had told her before he went that the Miami situation was temporary, a strategic repositioning, a necessary step in stabilizing coastal Meridian from a more favorable jurisdiction. She had not believed him. She had understood, in the way that people understand things they are not quite ready to articulate, that what Sterling Reed had needed from her had been fully extracted, and that extracted was the operative word. She missed the comfort, not the man. I understood that distinction the moment she reached it in the voicemail, and I understood it not as an excuse, but as the most honest thing she had said to me since October, perhaps longer. The comfort of the house, of the financial stability she had taken for granted for 17 years, of a life whose infrastructure had been so quietly and reliably maintained that she had never had cause to look at it directly until she had dismantled it. Sterling Reed had not offered her a future. He had offered her the sensation of momentum in a period when everything around her had felt static, and she had confused the sensation with the substance. She did not ask me to restore anything. That was the detail that distinguished the voicemail from what I might have expected. There was no request embedded in it, no negotiation, no proposal dressed in the language of regret. She was not calling because she believed there was something recoverable. She was calling because 2:14 a.m. in a furnished apartment 6 weeks after a civil hearing has a specific quality of reckoning that does not wait for a more convenient hour. She said she was sorry. Not for the legal record, those words had been exchanged through attorneys in language scrubbed clean of personal inflection. She said it in her own voice, unedited, in the 4th minute of a voicemail she must have known I might not listen to, or might listen to and not respond to, which is in some ways a more vulnerable act than saying it to someone's face, because it requires accepting the possibility of pure silence in return. She asked if I was doing better, medically, whether the tremor had improved. Then she said goodbye, in the ordinary way people say goodbye when they have nothing left to negotiate, and the recording ended. I stood at the kitchen window for a while after it finished. The lake had begun to catch the early light, the flat pewter surface developing the first faint suggestion of texture as the morning air moved across it. A heron was working the shallows near the eastern dock, entirely unbothered by the cold, entirely focused on the singular task in front of it. I listened to her cry, then I hit delete. Not with anger and not with satisfaction, both of which would have required a residual investment in the emotional architecture of what had been, and I had spent the preceding 4 months methodically divesting from that architecture, the same way I divest from any position that has ceased to serve its original function. What I felt, pressing that button, was something closer to completion. The clean, quiet finality of a ledger that has been balanced and can now be closed. The tremor in my right hand had been largely absent for 3 weeks. My cardiologist at the January follow-up had used the word remarkable in reference to the blood pressure readings, and had then looked at me over his glasses and asked what had changed. I had told him honestly that I had simplified my environment. He had written something in his notes and told me to keep doing whatever I was doing. Diane called at 9 o'clock, as she did most Thursday mornings, with a brief summary of the week's developments. The depositor civil action was progressing. The Georgia lien was holding. The DA's office had requested additional documentation, which her paralegal was preparing. Sterling Reed's New Miami LLC had already attracted the attention of a Dade County attorney representing a prospective investor who had conducted enough due diligence to be alarmed and was considering his options. The mechanisms were in motion. They did not require my daily supervision. "How are you?" Diane said, at the end of the summary, not as a professional courtesy but as a genuine question, asked in the tone she reserves for the rare occasions when she steps outside the role of legal strategist and speaks as someone who has known me long enough to notice things that don't appear in filings. "I'm well," I said, "actually well." A brief pause. "Good," she said, "you've earned it." After we hung up, I put on a coat and walked down to the dock. The heron had moved on. The lake was doing what lakes do in February, holding the cold with a kind of settled patience, the surface neither frozen nor warm, but occupying the temperature that belongs to this particular month without complaint or resistance. I stood at the end of the dock for a while. My right hand, resting on the railing, was steady. Somewhere in a Miami Beach office, Sterling Reed was setting up a new LLC, arranging new renderings on a new conference table, preparing a new performance for a new audience that didn't yet know what the previous ones had learned. The mechanisms would find him. They always find people who leave sufficient paper trails, and Sterling Reed, for all his fluency in forward momentum and strategic repositioning, had left an exceptionally detailed one. And somewhere in a furnished apartment in a city that no longer felt like home, Becky was waking up to a Thursday morning with a phone that showed a delivered voicemail and no reply. I had given her something more honest than a response. I had given her the same silence she had given me on the other side of a frosted glass door in October. The silence of a decision already made, a position already established, a future already in motion that no longer included the variable she had assumed was permanent. The water was very still. My heart was steady. Spring arrives at the lake without announcement. There is no single morning where you wake and find it transformed, no dramatic threshold between the pewter stillness of February and the particular quality of light that belongs to April. It accumulates instead, incrementally and without ceremony, the way lasting change always does. A degree of warmth in the afternoon that wasn't there the week before. The heron returning to the eastern shallows with the unhurried confidence of a creature that has never doubted its own welcome. The dock board I replaced in March already weathering into the grain of the boards beside it, the new wood losing its distinction, becoming simply part of the structure. I have been keeping different hours since January, not by design initially, more by the gradual recalibration of a body and mind that have been released from the sustained tension of the preceding months, and are finding, in that release, their own preferred rhythm. I wake early. I make coffee and take it to the dock before the light has fully established itself, and I sit with the water and the silence in the particular way that people sit with things they have earned rather than simply acquired. The tremor in my right hand appears occasionally now, a brief, faint reminder rather than a persistent condition, arriving and departing with the unscheduled irregularity of something that has lost most of its authority. My cardiologist has used the word stable in 3 consecutive appointments, each time with a degree of emphasis that suggests he means it as more than a clinical designation. My blood pressure, which had been a subject of careful management for 2 years, now falls within a range he describes as the numbers of a man living correctly. I do not tell him that the primary intervention was the removal of 17 years of accumulated financial anxiety from my daily operating environment. Some diagnoses are better expressed in plain language than medical terminology. The house on the Maple Line Street is still in the trust. I have not sold it. The question of what to do with it has occupied a portion of my thinking over the past several months, not with urgency, but with the considered attention I give to any asset whose optimal use has not yet been determined. The property has been maintained by a management service since October. The locks were restored to my codes the week after the civil hearing. The crystal paperweight, which I found still on the kitchen island during a brief visit in December, is now on the shelf above my desk at the lake house, not as a memento of what happened, but because it is a well-made object, and I see no reason to assign it exclusively to a narrative I have finished writing. The minimalism of the lake house was not an aesthetic choice. It was what remained after the process of reduction had completed itself. 2 bedrooms, one of which functions as a workspace, a kitchen that contains exactly what is needed to cook simply and well, bookshelves with the books I have actually read and intend to read again, no objects maintained for appearance, no rooms arranged for a visitor who never comes. The square footage is a third of what I had before, and the quality of the space, its responsiveness, its honesty, is the highest I have occupied in a long time. I work 3 days a week now, consulting, primarily complex forensic reviews for attorneys and corporate boards who require the specific kind of analysis that comes from 3 decades of pattern recognition in financial documents. The work is intellectually sustaining without being operationally consuming, which is a distinction I had not fully appreciated until I had access to both sides of it. On the days I don't work, I read, or walk the perimeter of the lake on a trail that takes 40 minutes at a moderate pace, or sit on the dock and do nothing in particular with the practiced ease of someone who has recently discovered that doing nothing in particular is a skill requiring cultivation. Diane calls on Thursdays. The updates have become progressively shorter as the legal machinery has found its rhythm and required less active steering. The depositor civil action against Sterling's Coastal Meridian entity reached a settlement in March. 14 plaintiffs, full return of deposits plus statutory interest, funded by the liquidation of the Georgia land parcel whose lien I had placed in November. The proceeds covered the settlement and returned a modest surplus to my account, which I noted with the flat professional satisfaction of a position that has resolved at par. Sterling himself is the subject of a joint investigation involving 2 state attorneys general and a federal consumer fraud unit, the details of which Diane conveys with the measured brevity of someone reporting whether present, progressing, outside our direct influence. He surfaces occasionally in the news cycle attached to a new set of investors who discovered too late what earlier ones had learned at greater expense. The pattern is consistent. The mechanisms continue to close the distance. The criminal referral from Judge Halpern's court was accepted by the district attorney in February. Becky's attorney negotiated an arrangement in March, a plea to a reduced charge, restitution tied to the divorce settlement terms, and a period of supervised probation. The details were communicated to me through Diane, at my request, rather than through any direct channel. I did not attend the proceeding. I had said everything I needed to say in a courtroom in November, and repetition serves no structural purpose. I have not heard from Becky since the voicemail. I think about her occasionally, not with the weight of unresolved feeling, but with the dispassionate curiosity I bring to any complex situation whose human components I did not fully understand until the analysis was complete. I understand her better now than I did during the marriage, which is a particular irony of endings, the clarity they provide about what preceded them. She had not been wrong that I treated the marriage like a ledger. The emotional accounting of 17 years had been, on my side, insufficiently attended to, the warmth present but not expressed, the stability real but not communicated in the register she needed to receive it. The clinical detachment that made me effective at my work had made me inadequate in ways I had not audited until the cost of that inadequacy had been fully realized. That is not an exculpation of what she did. The gap between feeling invisible in a marriage and committing financial fraud against a recovering spouse is not a continuum. It is a threshold, and she crossed it with planning and deliberation. But understanding the full ledger requires accounting for every line, including the ones that reflect poorly on my own management of the enterprise. I have not reached a conclusion about what that understanding means for how I move forward. I have simply filed it accurately, in the place where accurate things belong, and left it there. The lake is fully itself by mid-April. The surface carries the light differently now, not the flat pewter of February, but a living, shifting texture that changes character with every movement of air across it. The heron has established a routine in the eastern shallows that I have begun to think of as a kind of companionship, though I recognize the anthropomorphism is mine rather than his. He is simply doing what he does, with the complete and unself-conscious competence of a creature that has never questioned whether its particular method of operating in the world is the right one. I find that clarifying. My heart is steady now. Not metaphorically, though the metaphor is accurate, but in the literal, measurable, cardiological sense that my physician records in his notes, and that I experience as the absence of a monitoring awareness I had maintained for so long it had become background noise. The body, it turns out, responds to the removal of sustained stress with the same kind of recalibration that a financial system demonstrates when a structural liability is properly resolved. The numbers improve. The volatility decreases. The underlying fundamentals, given appropriate conditions, reassert themselves. I have been thinking, in the unhurried way that the lake house permits, about the nature of preparation, about the 12-year-old trust that Becky had signed without reading and forgotten without consequence, until the day it became the only thing standing between her plan and its intended outcome. About the firmware update I had approved 14 months before a Tuesday evening in September became the repository of a conversation that altered the trajectory of a civil proceeding. About the Harwick note and the 48-hour window, and the precise sequence of a response that had been assembled not from inspiration or anger, but from the patient accumulation of professional habit applied to a personal emergency. None of it had been designed for this specific contingency. That is the point that I find myself returning to most frequently, in the particular way that the mind returns to ideas that contain unexhausted meaning. The trust was not established as a defense against a wife I would one day discover was planning to sell the property to fund her lover's failing project. It was established because a forensic accountant who understands systemic risk does not leave significant assets unprotected simply because the specific threat has not yet materialized. The recording existed not because I anticipated needing it, but because I read documentation before approving it. The debt acquisition was possible because decades of professional relationships had created access to instruments and intelligence that a person operating purely from personal injury could not have assembled in time. Preparation is not paranoia. It is the application of professional discipline to the full scope of one's life rather than only the billable portion of it. That is the thing I would tell anyone who has stood at a door that no longer opens with their key, not as consolation and not as instruction, but as the straightforward transmission of a lesson that cost more than it should have and arrived later than it needed to. The quietest person in the room is not always the one being overlooked. Sometimes they are the one doing the looking. I am sitting on the dock as I record this final chapter, the late afternoon light doing what late afternoon light does in April at a lake in the middle of a life that has been deliberately simplified, making everything it touches look briefly, accurately like exactly what it is. The water, the tree line, the dock board that has already lost its newness and become simply part of the structure. My right hand resting on the railing still. There will be people watching this who are in the middle of something they do not yet have the language for, who are standing at a door that has been closed against them by someone who believed the closing was permanent, who have been told in one form or another that the life they built has already been sold and they should pack what remains and leave. To those people, I want to say only this. Read the paperwork, all of it. Not just the summary, not just the sections that apply to the immediate moment, but the provisions that seem irrelevant until they aren't. Understand what you own and how you own it. Know the difference between authority and the appearance of authority. Build the record before you need it, not in anticipation of betrayal specifically, but because precision is always better than improvisation when the stakes are real. And if someone tells you the house is sold, if someone hands you a note on a kitchen island and stands at the top of a staircase waiting for you to accept it as the final word on a transaction they have been engineering while you were recovering, while you were trusting, while you were treating a ledger as a marriage, and expecting that the other party was maintaining the same accounts with the same fidelity. Check again. Not with noise. Not with the reactive urgency of someone who has been caught off guard and is responding from that position of disadvantage. Quietly, methodically, with the complete and patient attention of a person who understands that the most consequential moves are made not in the moment of injury, but in the weeks that follow it, when everyone who underestimated you has stopped watching. Check the fine print. It is where the truth hides. And when you find what they forgot about, the clause, the document, the provision they signed without reading and dismissed without understanding, you will know exactly what to do with it. Because you will have already done the work. The water is still, the light is holding, my heart is steady. And the house, as it has been for 12 years and will continue to be for as long as I choose, is exactly where I left it.